welcome to Habitat Wildlife Keepers.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome everyone to Habitat Wildlife Keepers, a chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation based in Matthews, North Carolina, which is the southeast corner of Charlotte, for those of you who may be joining us from other parts of the state or country for that matter. That's one thing about the pandemic. It's kind of opened up our audience to anywhere you want, anywhere. Anybody can join in from anywhere. So tonight we're going to be talking about hummingbirds with Susan Campbell. Susan is an expert in hummingbirds. She's been doing this for years. I'll let her give you a little bit more information about her background, but she's been doing research for over 20 years, and she's got a lot of banding experience all across the state. And I would imagine all across the country too. There's not a lot of people that are certified for hummingbird banding. So, and we asked her here for two reasons: hummingbirds, bluebirds, and cardinals. Those are everybody's favorite birds. That's what we hear about all the time. And right now we're all feeling very, we're missing our hummingbirds because they have been gone since the later part of October. So we want to talk about ruby-throated hummingbirds, but we also want to talk about the winter hummingbirds that come and spend some time here in the Carolinas with us. So she's going to talk about that. She's been a part of a project to investigate, tag, and photograph these vagrant hummingbirds. Having banded over 4,000 hummingbirds, she will share her insights about these tiny, delightful creatures. She's affiliated with the Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. We also want to give you an opportunity, Susan, because I know that everybody is always looking for funding for research. So this is a shameless plug zone. If you want to plug your projects and tell people where they can send money to help support your work. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Carol. And I imagine a few of you, at least in the audience, have heard me speak for Mecklenburg County Audubon in the past, although it's been a while since I've even spoken for them. So it's good to be here and speaking to Hawk members tonight. And I do apologize for the fact that we don't have slides. So this is going to be somewhat of a conversation, and I think we will definitely have time for some questions. And even if I had the slides, it would be pretty obvious that what we're going to be talking about tonight is an overview of hummingbirds, and specifically winter hummingbirds here in the Carolinas, because the winter hummingbird topic is evolving, and it's something that I was very fortunate to get involved with as I came into the hummingbird sphere in North Carolina when I was a graduate student in Raleigh at NC State and was volunteering at the Museum of Natural Sciences. Very quickly, I learned about this fact that not only does North Carolina have hummingbirds in the summertime, but at that point we were learning about the fact that there are hummingbirds in North Carolina in the winter as well. And so I was very fortunate to be brought into this and then to be asked directly by my mentors, Bob and Martha Sargent in Alabama, who were winter hummingbird, I guess you could say experts, although I think Bob in his grave is probably rolling around hearing me say that, but they certainly were very knowledgeable about winter hummingbirds, and they were making a few trips a year here. And so they were very enthusiastic about having somebody in North Carolina be part of the team to start really diving into hummingbirds in North Carolina and documenting these birds as much as we can. So we are all very familiar, I'm sure, with ruby-throateds that are here in the summer. And our ruby-throats show up in April and they leave sometime September. These days it can be later in October. It's changing as the climate's changing. And so our final migrants don't necessarily depart the state until later in October. That's definitely changed since I started doing this work 23 plus years ago. So things are changing. And when we're talking about winter hummingbirds for the discussion tonight, we're talking about hummingbirds that are here in the Carolinas between November 1st and March 15th. So anybody that has a hummingbird during that time period, I would love to hear about, whether you see it or experience or know somebody that has one for just a short period of time during that time frame, or whether it's somebody that has a hummingbird on site throughout the winter. Because I maintain a database of all of these individual sightings, these birds, whether I see them myself, whether I get photos, whether I band them. I keep track of all of these sightings, and that in a lot of ways is more important and more valuable than the banding work that I do. I am fortunate enough to be a bird bander and to have the hummingbird specialty on my license. And so, yes, I have banded thousands of hummingbirds. Most of those have been ruby throats during the summer, but I've also banded thousands now, thankfully. It's been that long of a time period that I have banded quite a few in the winter as well. And in the wintertime, it gets very interesting because a lot of the individual hummingbirds that show up here in the wintertime are individuals that we can't necessarily identify by even the best of photographs in some cases. And so when somebody has a winter hummingbird that's sighted, and this is something that's been happening even today. I had somebody that was in contact through Facebook today that's had a hummingbird for a while here in the Raleigh area. One of the first things that I try to do is identify the hummingbird that they have. But in the wintertime, identification is very tricky, even with the best of photographs. And so that's one of the things that makes banding so important. And yes, there are quite a few hummingbirds that have spent the winter in the Charlotte area. This year, it is a little bit unusual. We have only had a report from one part of Charlotte, and it's the same general neighborhood where I spent some time banding last year, where I banded a Rufous hummingbird and an Allen's hummingbird in the same neighborhood. These two birds were both actually using at least two feeders, going back and forth, both of them, using two different feeders in the south part of town. But in the greater Charlotte area, most years we have a number of reports. And the thing about winter hummingbirds is that, yes, they tend to be here in the cooler months, and they are Western species that are more cold tolerant, like Rufous hummingbirds that are found in the Western US, found all the way up, believe it or not, in southeastern Alaska during the breeding season, up into Canada, into Alaska, that come this way. And we have other Western species like Calliope hummingbirds, again, a cold tolerant species that's found breeding at high elevations in the Rockies, that are moving in our direction as opposed to going due south. Most of the Rufous hummingbirds do end up in Mexico, a lot like our ruby throats, but there are Rufous hummingbirds, and we know this now, it's been the case probably for many, many years, that they actually come this direction. Rufous hummingbirds are a species that we now know are here in the winter, and we have them across North Carolina every year to some degree or another, from the mountains to the coast through the winter season. And then we have these other winter species like Calliope hummingbird, and an additional, believe it or not, 9 Western species have been documented here at least once so far. And a number of those have been seen and observed and have spent the winter or a part of the winter in the Charlotte area. And so when I hear about a hummingbird at this time of year, the first thing that I'm trying to assess is, what species are we looking at? And although ruby throats may winter inland in North Carolina, it's highly unusual, it's unlikely. The ruby-throateds that we now know are here in North Carolina in the winter are confined to the immediate coastline. But we have had individuals, including in the Charlotte area, that have successfully overwintered. And I think part of that has been because of the fact that there are feeders across the landscape, that feeders are abundant across the landscape. But let's think about hummingbirds more generally first. Hummingbirds are a species, a group of species that do indeed love sweet stuff. They visit flowers. And here in North Carolina in the winter, we have things like winter honeysuckle, coral honeysuckle or native honeysuckle. We have Japanese mahonia that's blooming. We have a number of plants that may be blooming that are perennial, that these birds may take advantage of, including some of the sasanquas, which are the wintering camellias that may have nectar associated with them. So they have nectaring opportunities here in the absence of feeders. They'll also use sapsucker wells. Like the sapsuckers, they are attracted to sweet juice. And so they may use sapsucker wells as well. But for the most part, hummingbirds across the board, believe it or not, are meat eaters. They are feeding on insects. And here in North Carolina, we have lots of tiny insects, especially the further east you go. But even in the mountains, we have tiny insects in the winter when it's cold. And if there's any doubt in your mind about this, those of you who are birders know that we have ruby crowned kinglets that spend the winter here, and golden crowned kinglets. These are two tiny insectivorous birds that come here and spend weeks of the year, every year, and they're here because, not because of feeders, sugar water, or any other kind of feeder, but because the insects are here. And so these insectivorous hummingbirds, and our ruby throats are too, during the summer months, they are mainly meat eaters. These birds are foraging mainly on insects. And so the Western species that are more adept at dealing with cold temperatures, like rufous, that are found where there's snow on the ground in April when they're breeding, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but these are species that are more hardy than our ruby throats. And so they are here in the wintertime, and they don't have a whole lot of trouble handling the conditions. And in a year like this year, where we've had up till now fairly warm conditions, hummingbirds that have been reported to me have been not staying put very long, because if they show up at feeders or at flowers that may still be blooming, and I've had flowers in my yard here in Wake County up till today, if they find feeders or flowers, they don't really need to stay put. Now that it's really winter weather, I'm suspecting I'm going to get reports from people that have hummingbirds that just show up at their feeders if they've maintained a feeder. So basically, maintaining a feeder in North Carolina year round is going to give you the opportunity of attracting one of these hardy Western wanderers. Now, of course, your yard, your location, is going to be one that's primo for them in terms of the bugs ahead of what you may still have blooming or how many feeders you have out. If your yard is not, or your neighborhood has not got those insects, then the hummingbird's probably not going to stick around for very long. But we have people here in North Carolina that have winter hummingbirds every year, from the mountains, believe it or not, the mountains to the coast, that have hummingbirds in their yard for part of the winter or all of the winter. Just kind of depends on the location and the situation. They may have a hummingbird there the entire winter. And we have people that have hosted hummingbirds, rufous hummingbirds, year after year after year. Rufous hummingbirds do live longer than ruby throats. They live on average 4 or 5 years, but up to 7 years. And we have had 2 different 7-year-old female rufous hummingbirds that have come back to the same winter feeder year after year here in North Carolina. And one of those, the first, was at a feeder in Shelby. And that female was really amazing. She got more and more colorful every year that I saw her. As opposed to ruby throats, they actually do the females get some color in their throat. And she became more and more brown with more and more rusty feathers in her throat every winter that I saw her. So people that attract winter hummingbirds, they may attract hummingbirds more than once. They may attract a different hummingbird, or they may attract the same hummingbird. It really kind of depends. But the bottom line is, if you leave a feeder out, you may attract a hummingbird during the colder months. It's not a guarantee, but you may. Personally, in the Sandhills, I attracted 3 different rufous hummingbird females over the years. It was, of course, as much fun for me as anyone. Here in Wake County, the last few years, haven't yet attracted one, but in Wake County, we've got several hummingbirds, including an adult male rufous that's back for his 2nd year in the same location. In the Charlotte area, in addition to that female in Shelby outside of Charlotte, we have had rufous hummingbirds going back quite a few years. Even before I was banding, there were rufous hummingbirds documented in the Charlotte area. We have also had the rufous hummingbird's close cousin, the Allen's hummingbird in Charlotte. And that was the first Allen's was a female that I banded last year. And indications are she's back again this year. I have to make a trip to try to recatch her. I've been waiting till it gets colder, so I have the better odds to do that. but she was sharing her feeder with a rufous hummingbird that was just down the street. It's possible that both of them are back this year. So in Charlotte, there have been winter hummingbirds year after year, and not just rufous hummingbird and Allen's, but also we had the state's very first Anna's hummingbird show up. That was the year before I started banding, the winter of 98, 99, at the home of someone, Judy Walker, very well known to those of you who are Mecklenburg Audubon members. That bird found her yard because of her pineapple sage that was blooming. Found that before the feeder, and that Anna stayed with her all winter. It was the state's first. We've had several since then, but that was the state's first. We've also had black-chinned hummingbird, which is a cousin to the ruby throat, black-chinned in Charlotte, I think in 2001, at least one of those. We've also had calliope hummingbird, and that was also in 2001, downtown Charlotte. And the thing about Anna's hummingbirds are very pink. The males have a lot of pink feathering on the head and on the throat. They aren't really distinctive as youngsters, but as adult males, they're very distinctive. Something like a black-chinned is very nondescript. And black chins and ruby throats are close cousins. And when you got a female, like the female that I found in Mecklenburg County in Charlotte, I had to literally catch her and very carefully scrutinize her outer wing feathers to make the ID. Black chins, unless it's an adult male that's got a black and purple chin, the females are almost identical to ruby throats. And this is where the identification element of this comes in. Not only telling difference between an Allen's and a rufous, which is tricky, but also black chins from ruby throats. And we have had a few ruby throats in the Charlotte area in the winter. Like I said, it's very rare, but in Charlotte, like in some other places in the Triad and the Triangle, there have been a few ruby throats. But separating and making sure that we've got a ruby throat from something like a black chin is challenging. The next one that's also challenging, but that has showed up in Charlotte, has been the calliope hummingbird, which is the smallest bird that we have in North America. And it doesn't seem all that small until you look at it up close. And if you're looking at a female calliope, which is what showed up in Charlotte that I banded, she was very similar to a ruby throat. She was just a hair bit smaller with a much shorter tail and some different coloration in her tail feathers. So it was another one where I had to have it in my hand, banding it, to know what I was seeing. This identification of winter hummingbirds, even for people that are very knowledgeable about birds, is tricky because they're so tiny, they're so fast moving, and the elements of their plumage that you have to look at to make an ID is tricky. So we've had calliope as well. And the kind of crowning jewel, which happened early in my career, actually happened in Charlotte as well. And that was North Carolina's one and only green-breasted mango. This hummingbird, which is a tropical hummingbird of good size, showed up in the winter of 2001. And it showed up in Concord. And it was on site for about 3 weeks. And it is a larger hummingbird, shouldn't be here, might have been pulled up here by tropical weather late in the fall, but it showed up for about 3 weeks. And literally people were flying into the airport from other parts of the country. These are hardcore bird people showing up to see this hummingbird at the feeder. It was pretty amazing. And it was something that really kind of blew my mind that early. But this is a case where hummingbirds, like all birds, have wings and they end up in strange places sometimes. And with hummingbirds, it's no different. And like I said, rufous hummingbirds, we expect to be here now because we know there's a subset of the population that winters here. But the other species that we find, like the calliope, even the black-chinned, and certainly the green-breasted mango and the Annas, are not really supposed to be here, but they can show up and survive fine, especially with a feeder. They're what we call vagrants. And they make life very interesting and very exciting. So when you attract a winter hummingbird, you don't necessarily know who you're looking at right away, unless it's something very large and very colorful like that mango was. But having any kind of a hummingbird in the winter months is very exciting. And for myself included, when I've hosted those rufous hummingbirds, I was just as excited and concerned about them at the same time, even knowing what I know, even knowing that these rufous hummingbirds are cold hardy, like the calliope as well. They're very cold tolerant. They use what we call torpor or nighttime hibernation to be able to handle the energy requirements of staying warm during the colder months of the year. They reduce their respiration and their heart rate, so they're able to conserve their energy. And actually, ruby throats do the same thing during migration, but winter hummingbirds do it a lot. They're very good at it. So
Susan?
yes, they're here and they know what they're doing, and they're very good at doing it. And they're going to be doing it, believe it or not, whether they find a feeder or not.
Susan, I have a question. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
This is Carol.
Yes.
And you talk about you can leave a feeder out, but we've got a
Yes.
question from someone in the audience here wondering, should you leave a feeder out?
Right. Well,
in the
that's
wintertime?
what I was just about to get to, because of
good.
the fact that these hummingbirds they're here and they're going to be here regardless of feeders. And we have documented plenty of rufous or hummingbirds that look like rufous hummingbirds. They might have been Allens, but probably rufous hummingbirds. We've documented them here away from feeders, where they're using just natural food from the foothills through the Piedmont into the coastal plain. Keeping a feeder out in the wintertime is not going to keep a hummingbird of any kind, even a ruby throat, in a location where it does not want to be or where it cannot necessarily survive. With rufous hummingbirds, we do know in North Carolina, in the northwestern counties, like up around Boone, you're not going to find a winter hummingbird up there throughout the entire winter. It just gets too cold. The insect life takes a hit. And so, in that part of the state, we know when rufous hummingbirds or other hummingbirds show up in the late fall, early winter, they're not going to stay put. They are not going to stay at a feeder just because there's a feeder there. Hummingbirds migrate, they move around because of food availability changing, and more so than the weather. They can handle the weather, but if the food availability, and by food availability, I don't mean sugar water, I mean insects. If that changes to a point where there is not enough there, they will move. And we have documented not only rufous hummingbirds moving because of weather and moving further south or further east, we've also documented this with ruby throats in North Carolina as well, moving around the coastal plain from the inner coastal plain to the outer coastal plain because of a change in the availability of food. They're not going to stay somewhere and starve. They're going to move. Their instincts are very good in terms of surviving during the colder months of the year. So leaving a feeder up is only going to be a good thing for these birds. And I think for the hatchier birds, the ones that are not adults yet, that are still figuring things out, even though a lot of what they do is based on instinct, they are still figuring things out. And so it's going to be a matter of them, having a little bit of a boost from the sugar water availability. But for the most part, again, they're going to need those insects to survive. They can't survive on sugar water or even, nectar, natural nectar alone. They need the protein to maintain their metabolism and to have proper nutrition. So leaving a feeder up is not problematic. And leaving a feeder up is actually easier in the winter. You only need to clean a feeder when it gets cold, when the temperature drops, about every week. And sugar water, the 4-to-1 mix, which you should be using, 1 part sugar, 4 parts water, is not going to freeze until the temperature drops below 27 degrees. And if you have a feeder near the house, we don't have a lot of nights. We may have the night tonight, where it is going to get cold enough for your feeder to freeze or to get slushy. And in that case, when people are hosting hummingbirds in the winter, or like myself, I've got sugar water out now. Tonight, I'll take my feeders in and put them back out right at dawn tomorrow, just in case someone shows up. To have that feeder out there overnight and freeze is really unnecessary, because the birds are not going to be feeding except during daylight hours. But for most of us here in central North Carolina, we don't have to worry about too many nights where the temperature is low enough that your feeder is going to be freezing. But if you have a hummingbird, and I have this situation quite quite commonly now, when folks understand or realize that there are not only ways to heat your feeder yourself using a heat bulb and some other things which I could have depicted with photos for you, but that there are commercial feeder heaters available for hummingbirds. A lot of them rush out and buy one. And the reason for this, and there are two companies that are involved with selling most of the hummingbird heaters on the market at the moment. The reason for this is because Anna's hummingbirds in the Northwest, and Rufus as well, are overwintering much farther north than they used to along the coast of Washington, Oregon, Washington, and Canada. And so there is a market for feeder heaters that started out there, but now they realize, that we have these birds in the southeastern US and that there are people that are interested in buying feeder heaters. And I've tried them out. We've tried them out here in North Carolina, even in the mountains, and found that these feeder heaters, both brands, work very well here and keep our sugar water thawed even through the night. So if you're not someone that gets up early, you can leave this on overnight, or if you travel, you can leave it on overnight and be providing for your hummingbird if you've got one without having to worry too much. But up until that point, I can't tell you how many interesting, ingenuitive feeder heaters that I've seen over the years. And it really doesn't take a whole lot. Myself, I just used a work light, which is fairly waterproof, but not as waterproof as these new feeder heaters. Used a work light to heat the feeder that I was maintaining for the birds when it got really cold. But these feeder heaters are fairly waterproof, and that is important, that you've got a design that is waterproof. You can still do it yourself. I've seen plenty of waterproof designs of feeders for feeders that are not commercially made. But it's fun to now know that you have this option that's fairly inexpensive to help you provide for your hummingbirds in the wintertime if you happen to end up with one. And now that I've got my folks in Fuquay that have an adult male that they pretty much are expecting or hoping they're going to be providing for the next several years, they went out and bought themselves a feeder heater this year once he returned. So it is an option. But again, remember that the sugar water is only a part of their diet. They're out there looking for insects and feeding on insects most of the time, even the coldest parts of the day. They're very good at doing that. And so that providing a feeder for them, however you do it, is something that they're appreciating, but not that they're wholly dependent on. So yeah, we have the hummingbirds out there. The other thing too is, having natural food sources and shelter as well. Most of us have shelter for hummingbirds in the form of some sort of evergreens, whether it's pines, hollies, again, sasanquas providing blooms right now and possibly nectar, but also shelter, and things like Leland cypress or cedar. We have lots of evergreens in North Carolina, magnolias, that provide very good shelter for these birds when the weather's bad. Also, in sheltering the birds, it's creating an environment for the tiny insects. So having the shelter, having those evergreens is important. And what goes hand in hand with that, as you all I'm sure are aware, is not using chemicals on the landscape at any time of the year if you can help it, because of the fact that they need those insects. So, not using any kind of herbicides or insecticides can be problematic for our pollinators, including hummingbirds. So lack of chemicals, having the shelter, having the food in the form of blooming plants or a feeder, giving them a complement of resources while they're on site. Now, the other thing that I will say about doing all of this for hummingbirds, even if you don't have a hummingbird, you may be rewarded in that another kind of similar bird might show up and take advantage. And the one that comes to mind, first of all, is a northern or Baltimore oriole. We find that Baltimore orioles love all the same things that hummingbirds do and tend to be found in the same habitat. And I've had that experience myself with orioles that have found my sugar water and found my peanut butter suet that I make myself They find the same resources. Western Tanager is another one. You also have that Bullock's Oriole over there in the Charlotte area that's taking advantage of these same sorts of things. So that Bullock's is probably the same one that was there last year as well. So like hummingbirds, some of our other wintering songbirds may come back and are a real treat from winter to winter. But also yellow-rump warblers and pine warblers will take advantage of sugar water. Right now, I have house finches, chickadees, and brown-headed nuthatches all drinking sugar water. So even if you don't end up with a hummingbird, you may find that what you're providing is taken advantage of by other species, even if you don't have a hummingbird show up. Now, as I said, hummingbirds tend to show up in the fall. When it gets colder is when we tend to see the first one show up. But something like a rufous hummingbird or any of these others, black-chinned, calliope, the last Anna's hummingbird we had in North Carolina on the Outer Banks didn't show up till later in January. A winter hummingbird can show up at any time. So if you don't have a hummingbird feeder up right now, but you want to put one up and see who you could attract, it's never too late. You could put your feeder back up tomorrow. Not guaranteeing you're going to attract someone, but you could, because these wintering hummingbirds, they're not always predictable. They're not always going to show up at the beginning of the season and leave at the end of the season. It may be something where they show up in the middle of the season, the end of the season. The last rufous I had showed up in March. I was shocked. She showed up in March. She didn't leave till sometime in mid-April. Turned out she had already been banded by a colleague of mine in Northern Virginia. I was ecstatic. That was very, very exciting. The reason we banned these hummingbirds, not only to get them in hand and identify a rufous versus an Allen's or a black-chinned versus a ruby throat, is because it's a way of understanding these birds' ecology in the winter and their movements and how they survive. And so putting that band on them really tells us a lot. And it's a very valuable part of understanding this group of birds. Winter hummingbirds, one of the last frontiers in ornithology, literally. It is an area where we are learning a lot all the time. And as much as I've been doing this for 23 years now, when it comes to the winter birds, I feel like there's so much I don't understand. Every year is a gift in terms of the birds that I do get to interact with. Even the birds that I don't interact with personally, seeing photos and getting that data is still very valuable. So the winter work, when it comes to hummingbirds in North Carolina, it's really a gift here in this state. If you live in Virginia, you're not going to have this kind of experience. The winter hummingbirds up there are very, very few and far between. But in North Carolina, we have this ability to attract and to intercept and to observe and to experience winter hummingbirds that a lot of other places do not have. And it is really pretty special. So if any of you have questions, you can also, we'll make sure you have my information so that you can ask questions or let me know if you have a hummingbird or you hear about somebody with a hummingbird. Of course, these days I get reports from all over the place, from eBird and Facebook, through the Carolina Bird Club, even, still people through word of mouth or through a bird store somewhere hear about me. So I'm still connecting with people all over the map, even though social media has become a big part of it. But I still love to hear from people. And it's sometimes when I do talks like this, that it results in communication about winter hummingbirds that I would not have heard about otherwise. And again, I would encourage you, if you're interested in hummingbirds, like I say, it's never too late to put your feeder up and maybe attract a wintering bird. But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to, worry about your feeder on a cold morning, that's okay too. It's not something that necessarily everybody wants to do, but it can be rewarding when you look out the window on Christmas or New Year's or Valentine's Day and you see a hummingbird out there. It can be pretty special, especially if it turns out to be one of these Westerners that's less common, like an Anna's, or if it's a banded hummingbird that came from somewhere else that was banded down in Louisiana last year or Tennessee or something. it really is a pretty special experience. This year, the only hummingbirds that I'm aware of in the Charlotte area, oddly, because I think of the weather, it's been so warm that these birds are moving around a lot, is my suspicion. The only hummingbird that I'm aware of is what I believe is going to be the Allen's hummingbird from last year, who's back. And there may be a Rufus hummingbird in that same neighborhood too. We're not sure about that. Surprisingly, those are the only two winter hummingbirds that we're aware of at this point in the greater Charlotte area. But again, that could change, especially in the next few days, now that we're getting finally into the colder part of the winter. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about some more. But that's not to say that there may be birds out there wandering around that haven't found a feeder yet.
All right, Susan, I got a question for you. We've got some, you talk about the vagrants that we have here during the winter time.
Yes.
Do those vagrants ever show up in the summertime?
It's a lot less likely. We have had some individual Western species that have shown up during the summer months, but it's less likely. But as we know with birds, they can get turned around when they're migrating or when they're moving. And so they can end up where they're not supposed to be, even during the breeding season. Things can get out of whack. So we have had some individual hummingbirds in North Carolina that shouldn't be here, here in the summer months. We've had broad-billed hummingbird on the coast, which is a Western species. We've had green violet ear, which is a Mexican species in Fayetteville. And we've had a few others. We actually had a Rufus hummingbird that spent 18 months in the same area before her migratory instinct kicked in, but then she still came back to Raleigh, came back to her initial wintering ground one more year after that. So yeah, it's a lot less likely in the summer, but it can happen. And that's why, you know, I say to people, you really want to watch. Certainly hurricane season could cause tropical or Western species to end up in North Carolina that wouldn't normally be here. So it's not at all impossible. It's just more likely that we're going to see these vagrant species here during the winter months than in the summer.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Also, we've got a question. I think this is probably for the birds that are here in the summertime, when those immatures are chasing each other around the yards and fighting over the feeders. What are they doing?
What are they doing? Ruby-throateds are extremely aggressive. They are just aggressive by nature, whether it's males or females, young or old, they're very aggressive. And in fact, female ruby-throats are larger than males, so they can win altercations. And I see this early in the season when the females are getting down to breeding. They don't tolerate adult males very well. So you will see them interact very aggressively, even in the late spring, early summer. But as the season progresses and young hummingbirds leave the nest and they're out and about in June and July and August, they are full of spit and vinegar. The males, the females, almost immediately, they are going to be defending flowers or feeders. That is just how they are. It's just the way they are built. And if you want to attract more hummingbirds, put up more feeders or plant more flowers. But don't expect that they're really going to get along, because that's just not in their nature to do so.
Okay. And it's a lot of time you see these, you know, when you've got hummingbirds, you see the pictures of them where there's just hundreds of them all feeding at a feeder. Those are probably not ruby-throated. Is that what you're saying?
There are places in North Carolina where I see ruby-throats that are feeding that way. It tends to be in locations that are pretty remote. Where it's likely generations of ruby-throats that are taking advantage of a widely dispersed feeder situation. And so that, yeah, you can have that situation. It becomes more common later in the season when we have lots of youngsters around. They may feed together at feeders. They're certainly going to fight over feeders. If you want to attract more hummingbirds and you want to see a spectacle, the best way to do this, and it's going to happen for most people later in the summer when there are lots of youngsters around who are very interested in feeders and kind of naive, cluster several feeders in an open area and watch what happens. Because if you've got feeders in an open area, in my yard, it used to be along the driveway because there was no place one bird could perch and defend 4 or 5 feeders. Those 4 feeders, and people have this, you'll see this in along maybe porches, covered porches, where there are 4 or 5, 6 feeders hung in a row. Hard for one bird to defend that situation. And those feeders are going to be very visible, and the ruby throats are going to hear one another. They're going to be drawn into those feeders, and it will create some mayhem late in the summer. I almost guarantee it. So if you cluster your feeders in an open area, wait for the show. I imagine that you will be rewarded.
Okay, that's very cool. So out from under trees and that kind of thing, so they don't have a perch. Excellent.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That's a good tip. Anybody has a question, please type it in. We've got a couple of comments. We've got somebody from Pensacola, Florida that's joined us, and they're hosting a buff-bellied hummingbird.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was a female, and that's her second winter in Pensacola, which is a very nice place.
Yes.
And then we also have someone
in North Carolina just once. No, twice. We've had 2 buff-bellieds here in North Carolina. One left before it just wasn't around for more than a few days. The second one was with us the entire winter in Winston-Salem. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. And take a moment, if you wouldn't mind, and give us your email address so that people know how to reach you.
Okay. That's fine. It's Susan, SUSAN, at N as in Nancy, C as in Charles, A as in Apple, V as in Victor, E as in Edward, S as in Sam.com. So that's Susan at ncavies.com.
All right. I put that in the chat feature so everybody can have it. And that way, if they've got a hummingbird or think they have a hummingbird, they can reach out to you.
That's the easiest way to contact me. I am now connected with a very new endeavor here in North Carolina. We have a bird observatory in the state, finally. And we are based, for starters, out of the Wilmington area. The name of the bird observatory is Cape Fear Bird Observatory. And if you go to the Cape Fear Bird Observatory website, if you would like to make a donation to help fund my research, that would be wonderful. My research really does involve a lot of travel cost, as you might imagine. That's one of the big things that goes into this winter work, especially when I'm going out to where the hummingbirds are. I'm always looking for and appreciating funding. Also, if you get in touch with me directly, I have an Adopt a Hummingbird program, which is another fundraiser that hasn't been shifted to the Bird Observatory yet. But the Adopt a Hummingbird program involves being connected specifically with one of the hummingbirds that I banned, getting a certificate and photos of that bird, and being notified should that bird show up again, either if I recatch it or if one of my colleagues somewhere in the eastern US recatches it, being the first one to know about that. It's been a great living gift type opportunity, and I've had hundreds of people do this as gifts for family members or just as a way to support my research for $20 an adoption. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with me directly and we can discuss that either now or in the future. And just know that if you come to any of my events that I do, and every summer I am at both Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden as well as at the Reedy Creek Hummingbird Festival in the area, that you will have opportunities to adopt hummingbirds at those events, because we're catching ruby throats at the peak of the season and didn't tend to catch a lot of birds. And it's a fun way to be able to not only adopt a bird, but if you adopt a bird at one of those events, you're the one that gets to let it go. So it's very special.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. We've got a question from someone who's asking how to keep bees off of hummingbird feeder.
Okay. A lot of hummingbird feeders in the past have been designed, and they're still on the market now, are designed so that the food, the sugar water, gravity feeds through the feeder into the feeding ports. And when that happens, there is seepage or drippage that occurs. And so the bees or wasps or anything else for that matter can find sugar water very close to the feeder surface. It's a matter of getting the right feeder. And there are now feeders on the market. And basically any saucer style feeder that you find is not going to be a problem with bees or wasps, because the food is all contained in the base of that saucer style feeder. Humzinger feeders are the classic example of this, although there are other feeder types that are saucer style. Droll Yankee has saucer style feeders as well. But any kind of saucer style feeder is not going to seep or drip because the food's all in the base. The other type of feeder, the only reservoir style feeder that does not seep or drip, this is kind of the more traditional type of feeder where you've got a cylinder above a feeding base. The only one that does not seep or drip, because it was very carefully designed and constructed, is Dr. JB's Clean Feeder. That feeder has a baffle in the base that keeps the food from coming up close to the feeding port where bees or wasps can find it. So basically it is a bee and wasp proof reservoir style feeder. Any other reservoir style feeder is likely to seep or drip. So it's a matter of finding the right feeder, because unfortunately, yes, in the past and in general, the feeders that are out there are going to be ones that seep or drip. And so you're going to have problems with bees or wasps. It's just the way that it has been historically. But there are bee and wasp proof feeders on the market now.
Okay, great. And Dr. J, for the Charlotte people, Dr. J lives here in Charlotte. So
he does. He does. For him, the feeder, and I should have said this, there's just not enough time to talk about all these things, but Dr. J's feeder project was something I came in on after it had been fully developed. And this was a project that Dr. J, who's a retired radiologist, came up with because he loves hummingbirds, and he wanted a feeder that wasn't going to be messy. In fact, he didn't even realize what he was creating was actually being wasp proof in the beginning. He just wanted one that wasn't going to be messy. When the wind blew, something that you could easily clean. And so that feeder, because it's got a wide mouth on it, has a base that pops apart. It's easy to clean in addition to being bee and wasp proof. But that project was just supposed to be a fun family project. He created such a good product that he couldn't keep up with production, and he had to sell it to somebody else. So Songbird Essentials now is the company that sells Dr. J's. And in fact, they sell a larger version, which people down on the Gulf Coast need. Dr. J's feeder initially was a 2-cup capacity feeder. Folks down on the Gulf Coast need 36 or 48 ounces of sugar water every couple of days, or every day in some cases. They were able to come up with a larger volume feeder. And so that feeder really is quite a success story. And it's one that I definitely use in my yard every summer, and have encouraged other people to use, and have installed in pollinator gardens and other places that I've been involved with.
Well, excellent. Yeah. It's a great feeder. All right. I can't think of any other questions I've got. I don't know if anybody else in the audience has any other questions.
Okay.
Matter of fact, and let me encourage folks to go ahead and jump in on that Q&A or the chat. But you had mentioned that you catch them. One of the questions that I had texted to me was, how do you go about catching them?
Yes, that is a common question. And people kind of envision me out there running around with a butterfly net or something. That's not at all how I do it. It's a very simple, old-fashioned technique. I have a wire box cage trap that has a large trap door on the front that I can hold open. And I put the feeder inside, in a location, in a position that the birds are used to coming to the feeder, and basically use that feeder as a lure to get them to come inside of the trap. And when they come inside to feed and they sit on the feeder, I will release the trap door, and I have them in the trap. And I have smaller trap doors on the sides that I use to very quickly take the bird out of the trap. And that way I've got it in my hand. And when it comes to banding and taking the data from these individuals, whether it's summer or winter, it's just a matter of minutes before I've done what I need to do and they're back on their way. And if you come out and watch me band, you will notice that it's not unusual for me in the summer, to have individuals come back to that trap minutes after I've released them. They don't seem to be too fazed by this whole activity. And in the winter, that is to my advantage because, as I said, it's not unusual for me to go out and recapture banded individuals. And I use the same technique, whether they're they're birds that are new to me, or if they're birds I don't know whether they already have a band, or if it's an individual that I know has a band on it. Like I said, that bird in Shelby, I recaught her 8 times, and I used the same box trap every time, and she just didn't seem to be too fazed. I had to be careful and tried to do it early in the morning when she was hungry, but using the box trap is typically the way that I ban hummingbirds. But I have a couple other methods that I sometimes have to utilize for various reasons, that are mesh cages, and a mesh trap that I will use if I have to fool a bird or two. But usually the box trap works like a charm.
That's very cool. In fact, that is, it's always interesting to see the behind the, how do you get something accomplished? Having the right tool for the right job makes all the difference in something like that. One of the other things that, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, and it's very safe and low stress on me and the bird, being able to, and as opposed to something like a mist net, which are these long nets that we use to catch songbirds. That's like a big gigantic hairnet. Getting any kind of bird, including a hummingbird, out of a mist net is a little trickier. With a wire cage trap, it's really pretty straightforward, simple, and quick, which is what I aim for. Whenever you're working with birds, the whole idea is you don't want to harm them, you don't want to stress them, because all in all, you want to be able to recapture that individual. You want that individual to survive and thrive and to be able to re-encounter it down the road. And so any kind of technique you use for anything, you want to be completely safe and harmless in terms of that bird's perception, so that it increases your odds down the road of being able to re-encounter it again.
That's really wonderful, the consideration you give to that. That's what I think everyone here on the meeting would want too. You talked about the various feeders, and of course the revelation that you really made a point of is that they are meat eaters, and it's insects that truly are sustaining them here throughout the winter. So of course, we always talk about not using anything that ends with "-cide", fungicides and herbicides, and of course insecticides. But additionally, what sort of insects? We've been programmed very well by all those side companies to want to get rid of all those little, insects. We call them bugs. We don't even call them insects. Creepy crawlies from very early on. So it's understandable people's inherent issues with that. But once they realize that indeed all those insects are food for all of our various creatures, what particular insects do they really go after?
They're going after anything that they can swallow, anything small enough to fit down the hatch. And so small, soft-bodied insects that can be anything from flies and tiny beetles to fruit flies and midges, maybe small mosquitoes, anything that's abundant and tiny that they can swallow. They're going to go after aphids. That's probably a great bonus there, because they're getting sweet stuff and protein in the same mouthful. But they're going to be foraging, looking under leaves, looking in pine cones and under bark for tiny spiders, any kind of invertebrate that they can see and that they can grab and that they can swallow is going to be a potential meal.
So that's yet another perfect example of not only leaving the leaves, but not being a tidy gardener and going ahead and be a lazy gardener. Let everything stand. Yes. Let those aphids get the last bit of your black-eyed Susans, because the hummingbirds are going to come and get all those aphids.
Yep. Yes.
beautiful.
On the coast, where I see people who are feeding ruby throats in the winter, overwintering ruby throats, the best yards for ruby-throated activity are those that are the most like a jungle, quite honestly, no doubt about it. You know, where you've got that structure, you've got a variety of vegetation, where you've got little hidey holes and niches and all kinds of insects potentially that are overwintering as well. That's what is better. A neat and tidy garden, not so much. Anything where there's, there are lots of tangles and lots of three-dimensionality to the vegetation that's left, that's the best habitat for sure.
And
We've
the
got a
easiest-
question, Daniel. We've got a question. Somebody's asking what's actually on the band. What information's on the band?
Okay, the band, like any songbird, like any bird band in North America, there are 9 digits associated with that band. Because a hummingbird band is so small, we use shorthand. We use a letter that stands for the 4-digit prefix, and then there is a 5-digit suffix. So there's a letter and 5 numbers on a hummingbird band, and that number is not engraved. There's no way we could do that at that scale. The number letter combination on a hummingbird band is going to be laser printed on a pressed aluminum band. And if you can envision a diaper pin, that is the dimension, that is basically the diameter of a hummingbird leg. And so when you see me taking hummingbird bands out, you will notice that I'm storing them on a diaper pin, because that pretty much is approximating a hummingbird leg. So I store my bands on diaper pins. I'll take them out, I'll open them just a little bit, put them in the special pliers that I have to basically just crimp them around the bird's leg, and we're done. So yes, they're very tiny bands. They weigh about 1/1000 of a gram, and they've got this number letter combination, unique number letter combination, laser printed in black on the band. So it's like a social security number. No other bird's going to have that combination.
All right, excellent. We've got another question going back to bees. Is it actually, we want to keep them off the feeder, but is it bad to have bees at the feeder, or is it just more of a nuisance?
It's a nuisance, but also they're competing for the sugar water. And in terms of yellow jackets, they can become very aggressive in the summer, and they may actually excuse me, they may actually be aggressive towards hummingbirds and cause them, to divert from a feeder. So you want to avoid having that competition at a feeder if you can. Bees and wasps are not going to be a problem for the hummingbirds. Larger wasps, like maybe bald-faced hornets or European hornets, that could be a problem for hummingbirds if they should sting them. But remember that these hummingbirds, they are active around flowers where there are bees and wasps all the time, so they know how to coexist. But I don't like to set up much in the way of antagonism at the feeders in the summer, so that's why, and the fact that I'm also sensitive to bee stings, I try to avoid that scenario. So I will use feeders, especially since they're so readily available now, feeders that are not going to be a problem and attract bees or wasps.
Well,
Okay, thank
really
you. Daniel,
fantastic.
did you have any other questions? This has been fabulous.
It really
Great.
has.
Right. I really apologize for not having the photos and the slides, but I think we've gotten the gist of it across, which I'm happy about. I hope people have gotten a lot out of it, and they can always contact me with more questions or comments or anything else after the fact. Since I've given you my email, I'm perfectly open to communicating with people further that way.
Well, please let us know what the hummingbird in Charlotte, if that's a returning Allen's, that would be awesome.
Yes, the word will go out. The only thing about the situation, like last year, it was sensitive. The homeowner is not in a situation where she can have birders really come to her yard. It's a situation, unfortunately, where you can only see the feeders from the back of the house, and It's just not a people-friendly situation. But I have shared photos of this in the bird that she took, as well as the photos that I took. She's a pretty good photographer, and this is a colorful little gal. So I'm really looking forward to going back and hopefully verifying that it is her. We know that at least one of the hummingbirds that is there has a band, and from what I've seen of the numbers she's been able to capture, I strongly suspect it is the Allens and not the Rufus that I banded there last year, but the Rufus may be there as well.
That's really fantastic. Thanks so much for
No
doing
problem.
this. And I got to say, I think you definitely win the award for best quote in arguably any of our presentations. The notion of hummingbird mayhem is just one of the best quote combination of words I've ever heard. So thank you for that, Sue.
Sure, no problem. And I hope to hear from some of y'all that have a winter hummingbird, or maybe see you at one of our summer events, or somewhere along the line, because I do tend to come to Charlotte, and certainly love to talk about hummingbirds and see people and share hummingbirds with people. So hopefully have more interactions down the road.
Indeed. Thanks again. Thanks so much. And
Thank you,
thanks
Thank you
Susan.
so
everybody
much for having me.
Happy
sticking
New
around with us.
Year.
Happy New Year.
Take care, everybody.
Happy New Year, everybody. Well, hopefully we'll see you in February at this February meeting for mushrooms.
That'll be a fun combo. No question.
That will be fun.
See you, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right. Good night.